be looking out for. And on the underground scene, there's a lot of other questions around that, and that's accessibility. It was also written some incredible pieces on Vice, specifically around the ethics of developing various psychedelic compounds, patenting psychedelic compounds, really complicated stuff. I've done a little reporting on patents, and wow. So how did you approach this writing, knowing that you were being to an audience and really knew nothing about this world?
Yeah, I think it was helpful that I didn't know that much about patents either when I started. The patents have started, like I said before, around a concern for me about accessibility and cost and things. You know, I started asking, like, what's the reason that psychedelic therapy might be inaccessible? And what would cause it to cost a lot of money? And I started thinking about other pharmaceutical drugs and why drugs cost so much money. And then when I saw there was a psychedelic patent tracker that Psychedelic Alpha publishes, and I saw this graph going up of like all these patents increasing. And to be very clear, I'm not anti-patent at all, but I was thinking at this time, this was a couple of years ago, that nobody was really talking about patents. And there is a relationship between drug patents and drug cost in other pharmaceutical areas. And I felt like patent law was just this inaccessibly complicated thing that everyone is so bored by and simultaneously confused by. And this actually, to me, is one of the roles of journalism, is to democratize information. And I will take on the task of trying to understand this so that I can put it in simple terms. And that's basically what I did, or what I tried to do, is that each article I wrote about a psychedelic patent, I tried to have it be a case study of something that we could learn about patent law, whether that's what prior art is, or different kinds of strategies that pharmaceutical companies use to lock up the patents in a certain area. And I tried to have it be really didactic, because that's what I was doing. I was learning in the moment, just saying, like, this is something that's happening and it's new to this space right now, and we don't know what the implications are, but it felt like the secret language that only rich people with lots of patent lawyers could understand. And I wanted everybody to be able to be like, oh, this company has this patent, this is what it means, and let me look at it and understand what the implications are of them getting this patent. So I think we're still all very new in this area, but I care a lot about just accessibility and cost, and also true innovation, like people being able to innovate within psychedelic research and not be blocked by patents, and understand what the relationship between innovation and patents are. So I think that was sort of my process there for me, but I think it ties back into the responsibility of psychedelic journalism, which is that sometimes you have to learn something that's not as sexy or fun as like taking mushrooms for a story for Vice, but like reading a 300-word patent document instead.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
Michelle, you've mentioned it a couple times already, but you cover the underground a lot, and I know something that's important to you is talking about the value that people can find in doing psychedelics and drugs in a variety of contexts, not just in a clinical context. Will you talk to us a little bit more about that? There's a big emphasis on science and clinical use of psychedelics here, so why have you devoted much of your reporting to covering this particular area of the movement?
Yeah, I think that, the line between therapeutic and recreational is much thinner than people want to believe. And I think that for the longest time, we've been relying on the underground for anecdotal stories and experiences on drug culture, because we haven't had much else. And I was just on a panel earlier today with a bunch of patent people where they were depending on Erowid to show that certain drug combinations are not unique. So, I find that so much wisdom has been cultivated in the underground just through direct experience, and what science is doing now is kind of catching up to that and validating it and giving it sort of a scientific rigor. But a lot of these things have been full wisdom for a really long time, and I think that there's a lot of healing that happens in just pleasure and coming together in community on the dance floor and working it out of your body, working out capitalism. So that's kind of why I've been focused on the underground. But, I kind of want to go back to something we were talking about earlier about how the psychedelic media landscape has been changing. And one thing that I've noticed is a lot more legacy media has been coming into the space and covering things and bringing criticism into an industry that I think is not that used to taking critique. And I know, like, Sheila has done a lot of reporting on this and taken a lot of heat. And I think, when we think of like traditional, but like hardcore psychedelic journalists who've been around for a long time, they've been doing a lot of amazing work, but a lot of it has been advocacy based. And I think it's really interesting to see this shift. Like, it's not like legacy media is better. I mean, God knows I've spent so much time just trying to convince an editor who's never done psychedelics why the story is important. I think they still have a lot of learning and catching up to do. But I think that they're bringing this sort of like critique into an industry that really needs to be more open to it. I'm just gonna say it. MAPS made us sign a waiver to be journalists at this conference, saying that we would not disparage MAPS, which I think is antithetical to what psychedelic movement should be about.
And this is a good opportunity to talk about psychedelic anecdote. I know that that's something that you wanted to bring into this conversation. We're obviously at a moment where, much like in cannabis, there are way more stories of people saying psychedelics have changed my life than there is data to back them up. And traditionally, anecdote and narrative has played a really important role in just honestly making perhaps boring stories a little bit more interesting to readers. Can you talk to us about what you think the role of anecdote should be in psychedelic journalism?
Yeah, so this is a common tool that journalists use. And when you read an article, often it starts with a story of somebody and then it pivots to whatever the larger topic is about. And I've done this in lots of my own reporting. And it really is only recently that I started thinking about the use of anecdote in psychedelic journalism in particular, because I started working on this story about clinical trial design and how the expectations of participants influence outcome. And a big place that a lot of participants get their expectations is from psychedelic journalism. And they get those expectations from the anecdotes that we put into our stories. And so I just started thinking about this feedback loop between the research that I was reporting on, the people who were in those trials, and how the journalism that they're reading is like influencing the thing that I'm reporting on. And then I started to like think about this cycle and like how it's just like it has this big impact both on the work that's happening and people's actual expectations. And the fact is that a lot of the anecdotes that go into journalism articles are positive ones, or they're very, very negative ones. And there's not a lot in the middle, and psychedelic experiences vary so much. Even as an individual, you can have one psychedelic experience one day and a completely different one the next week. And so to generalize and to use any psychedelic experience as a representative of everybody just doesn't represent the pluralism of these experiences. So I think that it just requires a lot more care maybe than we're used to as journalists when we're including like an anecdote in a story, just thinking about what would this mean to somebody who read this? What conclusions would they take from this specific anecdote? And is it really necessary to include? Like, I've just started thinking that maybe I've like thought about taking a step back from like making an anecdote the center of a story, even though you want to do it because it's a really powerful story, but I just think that the impacts of it are far-reaching. So I don't know, I'm unresolved on this. It's a conflict that I've been having. I'm curious to hear what you guys think.
Yeah, well, earlier I talked about using other people's anecdotes and the things they tell me, but I use my own stories a lot too. I think that, saying, I was at a club and someone gave me a 3-MMC gummy. Like, what? Like, I think that stuff like that actually is very destigmatizing as well. Like, I come from a background of, I come from Asia, a very conservative background. People don't expect people like me to be a professional journalist writing about drugs. I still get that all the time. And I think it's so interesting, that researchers have this stigma of you shouldn't be doing the drugs that you're researching because that kind of delegitimizes you. And I think journalists, like, it's tricky. Like, we get it from both sides. It's like you're stigmatized for doing it, you're not taken as seriously, but you're also given flack for not doing it. So it's just like, I don't know. But the fact is that my body is the vessel through which I've experienced and understood the world. And so I think self-experimentation is a really important part of reporting as well. Yeah.
I guess I just want to clarify that I'm really coming at this question from a mental health perspective, and like thinking about, there's a philosopher who talks about how people who are trying to navigate the mental health landscape can be epistemically adrift sometimes, because they're trying to find what works for them, and they hear a story, they try it, and it doesn't work for them, and they were promised that SSRIs would cure them, and then they didn't, and then it was transcranial magnetic stimulation, and then that didn't work, and it's just exhausting and depressing to do all this. So when they hear a story about psilocybin curing depression and then it doesn't work for them, I think that's where my thought about the plurality of anecdotes comes in. I do think that because I also think first-person experience is really important, and your project was so powerful because you included anecdotes in it too. So this is what I'm saying. It's complicated.
Well, it is, I think it's a challenge in particular for psychedelic journalism, which is why, my day job is a host for NPR, but this series that I did was in the form of an audio documentary, in the form of a podcast, because it allowed the space for nuance. It's such a nuanced topic, and within someone's experience, there's so much variation there that you want to be able to encapsulate and also provide context for. And so the space of time allows for that. And I guess it would also be the space of the printed word allows for it, or a documentary allows for it. I do think it's a challenge for daily news to do the anecdote, to give it justice, and to be able to provide that kind of nuance that it needs, because it's just so quick, and it's either positive or negative, or positive with a slight negative experience, but you can't even get into why the challenges might have been there, of why that negative experience happened. So, yeah, there's no answer for it, but I think the anecdote is extremely powerful. And especially, I keep going back, for all of us, we need to see ourselves in people, or to see the truth of ourselves in people to have a better understanding.
I also just want to name the systemic challenges that we're up against as journalists, and that's a whole separate panel, but maybe an editor's not going to think it's so sexy to tell the story of someone who, their life was changed a little bit, but they're still struggling in some ways, and maybe they're going to do mushrooms again, but maybe they won't.
Right.
Yeah. It is crazy how much prejudice and just ignorance there still is, I think, in traditional legacy media publications. I remember a young journalist writing to me maybe a year ago saying that she really wanted to cover this study that was done about giving ayahuasca to Palestinians and Israelis for conflict resolution, and every publication that she went to, editors were telling her this is insulting, this is not the way that people should be resolving this, it's just, we don't want to touch it. And now, that study is the keynote at this conference. It's just crazy, I think. And so, that's kind of why I started my newsletter, because I was just sick of waiting for editors to understand what's going on. And, trying to find the one editor at the publication who's the groovy one who gets it.
It does feel like there's been an evolution. I remember even when we started Double Blind that legacy outlets were primarily covering the MAPS trials investigating MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, the Johns Hopkins research looking at psilocybin for end-of-life distress, but we weren't seeing conversations about psychedelics for racial trauma, psychedelics in the underground, the ethics of sending psychedelics through drug development companies and patents. So we're seeing a lot more of it, but also, legacy outlets are covering everything, right? Psychedelics are just a little blip on the radar of all the news stories that these editors are taking a look at. And how important do you all think psychedelics are? And this movement is relative to all the other things that magazines and news outlets are covering today.
Can I answer that sort of, because you asked me a question, but you also said something that brought up something for me.
Yeah, of course.
I just want to also say, with that, we also need to think about what we're saying when we use the term journalism and storytelling and what that means. So we're talking about it in the scope of legacy journalism and traditional journalism, but different modes and ways of getting story out there is really important when we're talking about psychedelics and psychedelic therapy in particular. And so I think that's just something we should be thinking about, in that covering this does not always mean covering it in a mainstream way. It could mean covering it in social ways. My daughter, for instance, who was 16, everything she knows about psychedelics is not for me. She knows it through the TikToks that she assembles together. And I think that that's important to understand, that people are getting these bite-sized bits of information that really that's giving them real information. And also, there's misinformation.
Thank you for that. It's true. There's so many people on TikTok getting information about psychedelics.
Yeah, and every social platform.
Yes. Yes.
I think psychedelics and drugs in general are the framework for every issue in society. I think it is the undercurrent that has shaped so much, from music to culture to policy. And if you look at the world through the framework of psychedelics and drugs, I think you can talk about any topic that you want. So psychedelics isn't like siloed as its own little niche world. I really think it's a lens, it's a filter. And if you think about like policing, we're talking about George Floyd being arrested on drug charges, right? Like that is a drug story to me. And we're also talking about bodily autonomy, which is also an issue for abortion. Like we're talking about fashion and art and music. Like, I mean, it's just everywhere once you actually start to see it. I love that, Sheila.
I mean, I agree with you that psychedelics are not siloed, which is why I was sort of talking before about how the expertise of people in all different fields is really relevant to psychedelic journalism. I think it's sort of like, I think about this with mental health a lot, that it's not just that psychedelics are a mental health story, is that there's a big mental health thing that psychedelics can raise awareness of, which is like, why isn't therapy covered by insurance? Like, why don't we know more about the kinds of therapy that are helpful for people? Because all of these questions are coming up in psychedelic research, and they're revealing these other issues that have already existed in these domains, but psychedelics just are so extreme that they bring them to the forefront right away. And so I think in that sense, it's hard to like make a priority list for all of society in general, and like what's most important and what's not important. But I do think that psychedelics can be a lens, and as a journalist, like they can really help you to contextualize the societal issues that pre-existed when psychedelics were in the limelight.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and thank you, Karen.